understand his choice for calling Matthew as a disciple would not have been a very popular choice given the work background that he did. But this is all to set up what really takes place later. Is that Matthew decides that he's going to hold a feast for Jesus. And so he throws this party, and some suspect that he threw this party because he was called by a rabbi, which at that time was a great honor to be called by a great teacher and to learn from him. So it was a great honor to have. And so it's thinking that Matthew might have thrown the feast to keep, to show how thankful he was for accepting the call of Christ. But this interaction between Jesus at the feast demonstrates the work of Christ in the world. Because of Matthew standing as a tax collector, Christ hanging out with him, not to mention all of Matthew's friends who were also tax collectors, was seen as kind of taboo. You weren't supposed to hang out with those people because there would be a bad influence on them. But he did these things Christ did these things that were considered taboo at the time because he was not afraid. Because this is why Christ had come. And so if we are paying close attention to the scripture, we see exactly why the calling of Matthew is important and why the feast sets the stage for the work that Christ is going to perform later on. That is, Christ came for people who you don't necessarily want to hang out with. People who you don't want to have influence on you or your choices. Christ came just for those people as well. And see, the feast is about who is going to come into contact with the work of Christ, exactly who it is made for. Sinners. And so we come to the feast, and nothing says celebration like a feast, and the calling of Matthew is this catalyst for what happens next. This whole reason why we have this recorded in Luke is because of Matthew's decision to throw a feast for Jesus. For being called by a rabbi was a great honor, and it was usually celebrated by the family because usually a person was called at a young age. And so the family would celebrate. But since Matthew was no longer the required age to be called as a disciple, he doesn't have the family around him. He doesn't have the relatives around him. So he invites the people with whom he knows best. His fellow tax collectors and their families. And the feast was to be thrown in Jesus' honor. And Christ attended as the guest of honor. Because he was the teacher who had called Matthew. And so she should be celebrated. And so a feast was thrown. Now, another possible reason for why the feast was thrown is because Matthew recognized who Christ really was. And he wanted to have a chance for all his friends and family and other acquaintances to experience firsthand the teaching of Christ. So this was kind of his way of getting people to come and experience Christ who would not normally have had the chance to see and experience Jesus' teaching. And for this reason, the feast is kind of irrelevant because it's less about the party and more about who is attending the party. For it reveals the nature of Jesus' mission on this world. I mean, the feast literally is setting the stage for the work of Christ to be made plain. And he makes it plainer later because he's surrounded by exactly the people with whom he has been sent to save. Whom the larger culture said he should not be associating with. For they were sinners. And you don't associate with sinners. For the tax collectors were considered to be wicked people. They were shady. They defrauded people of their money. In fact, they were ones who were hated by everyone. And even those who were Jews, as tax collectors, were seen as traitors by their own people. And by Christ being there at the feast, the Pharisees and the scribes believed he was ignoring the sound wisdom and advice that they had received throughout the Old Scriptures. So in Psalm 1:1, we see that there is the advice in which the writer says, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers." Right there, the writer of Psalms says, "Blessed is the one who doesn't associate with the wicked. Blessed is the one who doesn't take the way of the sinners. And blessed is the one who doesn't sit in the company of mockers." Well, for the Pharisees and scribes, Jesus was sitting amongst them. Jesus was sitting amongst the tax collectors, the ones that they defiled, the ones they really didn't like. And so we see here pretty much from the writer of Psalms, it's a good idea not to associate with those types of people, but rather you need to set yourself aside and set yourself up in the commands of God and find the goodness that's within them. Later in Psalm 1, it talks about being set up by a stream of righteousness. So you're supposed to be set up by a stream of righteousness rather than dealing with the lawlessness of the wicked, and that you should have nothing to do with it. Or, better yet, it's kind of what the writer of Psalm says in 26, 3-5, that you're to focus on God, because the writer says, "I have always been mindful of your unfailing love, and I have lived in reliance on your faithfulness. I do not sit with the deceitful, nor do I associate with hypocrites. I abhor the assembly of evildoers, and refuse to sit with the wicked." You see, there's this whole idea of ignoring people who are going to have a bad influence on you, that you are to stay away from. That if you truly love God, then you will not stand being around those people, but you are to avoid them at all costs. In fact, this is still a very popular thing even today, is that you're supposed to avoid people who are going to bring you down. You're supposed to avoid people who have a negative influence on you. And that if you want to go somewhere, if you want to make good in your life, then you need to only seek out those who are going to influence you in good ways. People who are going to have a positive impact on you. People who are who will build you up rather than tear you down. I mean, this is what we do, even today. If you want to be successful, what do? You hang out with people who are successful. So there's this whole idea of